You said earlier that there are now only 10 to 15 media conglomerates left in Germany. And then, of course, there are the state media. And then there are also independent media, like Alexander Walasch's. Can you give me an overview of how strongly these independent media are represented in Germany? Is there a thriving independent media landscape? So the media landscape is currently flourishing, but of course it doesn't have the scope of the state media. The state media is extremely ineffective, but even if I spend 10 billion euros for something that someone else can do with 500 million euros, none of the private media on the opposing side of the political spectrum has 500 million. Which means the private media, which I'm going to call right-wing conservative, cover a huge spectrum from esoteric to conservative. I don't think there are any far-right extremist media at all if I use the US as a benchmark. And in that right or conservative space, there are usually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or maybe 10 at most. There are no large companies on the other side. There is only one radio station in Germany that is conservative, and that is Kontrapunkt, but that is based in Switzerland and not in Germany. And then there is one conservative TV station called Auch Tipp auf Eins. That one is based in Austria. That means Germany has no private conservative televisions and no significant private radio stations. But there's a ton of internet platforms, like Alexander Walasch's, TG's Einblick, Ach.com, Apollo, Niehoff. There's a whole lot on the internet, because the internet obviously has an advantage. The entry costs are significantly lower. If I wanted to launch a daily newspaper in the past, I'd have to put a few million on the table before I had the first copy. Today, all I need for a decent internet platform is maybe 500 or 1,000 euro for a mini studio to get it running. That means the market entry costs are dramatically lower. That's pro freedom of expression. The problem, on the other hand, is that they have to gather in-depth information online. They do relatively little research on their own, or they work with volunteers. So these reports are not usually at a high journalistic standard, but since the state media and large private media on the left continue to get worse and worse, well, the journalistic quality is approaching the same level. But that's the situation right now. The independent conservative media have very little money, even just to be journalists. And that's why, if you look at these internet news platforms, you find a lot of older men and women there. Why? Because they're financially secure. They're doing it pro bono, meaning they don't do it in order to earn money. Well, what you just said about the internet is very interesting. And that brings us back to Alexander Walasch. Because the state must consider the internet as particularly dangerous. Yes, and it does. And now we have arrived at our second topic. What does the state do? Well, in the case of Germany and the EU, the state systematically restricts freedom of speech. Systematically. So, the debate that's currently taking place with Musk, with X, let's just take X. I'm not even talking about Alice Weidel's conversation with Musk, only X. That's a vicious fight in Germany because, and this sentence really exists in Germany, freedom must be protected from itself.
Man muss die Freiheit vor sich selbst schützen.
You have to protect freedom from itself. Explain that to me. I didn't just make that sentence up. It's actually been used several times in court rulings. It means if I allow people a freedom I consider suspect, they could endanger freedom, and before they endanger freedom, we don't allow them to speak before they can commit a speech crime. That is the end of freedom. Yes, normally among intelligent people, among the American founding fathers of the Constitution, yes, but not in Germany. This is a very harsh accusation that I'm making here. Since I'm a lawyer, you can imagine I have a path of suffering behind that accusation. I regularly appear in court with cases like this. And there's an increasing conformity of the prosecutors, but also of the judges, because in Germany they are not elected, they are all appointed by the state, all judges in Germany. And with judges, every now and then you have a good judge among them. That's someone who's between 50 and 60 years old. He doesn't aspire to work for the higher courts anymore. He doesn't want to pursue a career anymore. And he says outright, you can all go to hell. I'm going to do what's right. But all the younger judges don't want to stay at the district court. They want to work for the regional court and the higher regional courts. And what's interesting, in Germany there is a significant number of prosecutors that become judges. Well, it's not a surprise then what the verdict will be. Formally, everything was done according to the rules, but all within the political politically correct paradigm. And now we have reached the topic of the internet. Originally, the internet was like one big meadow, practically like the Wild West. And this Wild West is now being civilized. Nowadays, they are trying in Germany, not just there, but also in the English-speaking and Arabic-speaking world, to survey the entire internet to see if it conforms with German legal standards. So if I post something in America, on a US platform, on a traditional US platform, and that is actually an attack on the United States that is taking place here, then I can be held responsible for it in Germany. Although it's not subject to German law. Yes, that means the DSA, the Digital Services Act, only applies to EU states, right? No, that's an imperialist act worldwide. According to the legislation, the DSA does, of course, apply only to the territory of the European Union. That's correct. Every EU law only applies to the territory of the EU. That's clear. But every measure, including those from the US, by the way, does, of course, impact other countries. That means if I say something that I'm allowed to post in Germany, even if I do it on another platform, as long as my legal residence is here, I'll be attacked here. Correct. I remember a few years ago, Thierry Breton spoke to Musk. That was maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And he told him, listen, now with the DSA, which is about to be passed, be careful. You no longer have that freedom. You have to censor your people. You have to censor everything we tell you. What we don't like, that has to go. And Musk didn't know what to say to that. He just said, yeah, and he looked very, very uncomfortable in that situation. Yeah, he probably hadn't quite grasped back then what this actually meant. He seemed completely shocked. He kind of understood what it meant, but didn't know how to react. Okay, before we go back to Alexander, I'd just like to talk briefly about the Moron case. Perhaps you could summarize it and also talk about Nancy Faeser's days of action against online hate crimes. Yes, that's Nancy Faeser. I'll start with that part. That is quite interesting. Nancy Faeser is the Federal Minister of the Interior and the head of the German Secret Service. The Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution reports to the Federal Minister of the Interior, and simultaneously they declare themselves responsible for online freedom. That would be like if in America the FBI chief were in charge of the Ministry for the Interior. One can smile a little and say, yes, legally that may be so, but in practice it might not work, exactly as in Germany. And Nancy Faeser is one of the most evil, scheming politicians in this country who, at the same time, is trying to buy activists under the banner of freedom. They're actually being bought, these people. There are no NGOs that work hard for nothing. Almost all of them are paid for by the state. Now, recently, there were very large demonstrations, 30,000, 50,000, or 100,000 people. Within 4 days, 100,000 people were on the streets. They were largely paid for by the government, like in the worst times of socialism. Not that the Federal Minister of the Interior transferred money to them directly, but the NGOs paid for the buses and even paid people money for every day they participated in demonstrations. And can you prove that? Yes, you can see that. First, not a single bus receipt has surfaced out of hundreds of thousands. Not a single person who took the bus said, I paid for it myself. Not a single one. And the NGOs paid subsidies for the buses that can be proven. Not in every single case, because they are private companies, NGOs. They don't have to disclose everything. But that was clear. And someone made a small mistake. The Office of the Federal Chancellery, with the instruction and signature of the Chancellor, transferred 5,000 euros to grandmas against the right. Yes, that was a stupid mistake. Normally, the money is transferred to an NGO, and they would have transferred it to grandmas against the right, probably as a contribution to civics education. Yes, that happens systematically. And in the meantime, they don't even try to reveal this because they also own the justice system. And the justice system simply doesn't pursue it. So what happened here is embezzlement of public funds. Let's go back to these action days against hate crimes. What is that, and what is the case Niehoff? I have to take a breath. It kind of fits into the same structure. That is, action days is, of course, nonsense, because this kind of thing happens every single day online. They are trying to increase the pressure shortly before the federal elections, or before state elections, or before special events. And it
vor
was
der
clear
Bundestagswahl war klar, die
before
AfD
the
wird wahrscheinlich
federal
ein gutes
elections that the
Ergebnis
AfD
erzielen.
would
Wie gut,
probably
wusste
achieve
keiner.
a good
Die meisten
result.
waren
No one
sogar
knew how
davon
good.
überzeugt, dass sie eher auf über
Most people were
25
even convinced
kämen.
they would probably
Und
get
deshalb
over
sind diese
25%.
ganzen
And that's
Aktionstage
why all these
ausgelöst
action
worden. Das
days
war
were
überhaupt die
organized.
Ursache.
That was the real
Und jetzt
reason.
sind
And now
Leute
people have been
überprüft worden,
investigators. Letters have
Schreiben
been sent out.
rausgeschickt worden. Es
In
gibt in
Germany, there
Deutschland,
are so-called
in den USA fällt das, ich weiß nicht, ob es das
radar
gibt. Es
days.
gibt
I don't know if that
Radartage.
exists in
Kennen Sie
America.
das?
These radar days, are you
Ja.
familiar with them?
Das
No.
sind Tage, an denen die Länder
They are days when
aufrufen,
Germany
nur
federal states
Radarkontrollen
call
zu
on the
machen. Das
police to
heißt,
do
für den
nothing but radar
Autofahrer.
speed checks
Das
on
heißt, da
drivers.
checken
That
auf
means
alle
there's a
20
radar
Meter,
trap
ich
every
übertreibe
20
jetzt mal,
meters.
steht ein
Well, I'm
Radarfahrer.
exaggerating
Alle
here.
sind draußen.
All the
Es wird
police is
nichts mehr
outside
überprüft, keine
checking who's speeding.
Vergewaltigung, kein
Work on
Diebstahl.
everything
Es wird
else,
nur
like
Radar
rape and
gemacht
theft, is
draußen,
on
von
hold that
morgens
day.
bis abends. Das
Only
sind
radar checks
Radartage,
are
das
done
heißt
from
dann
morning to
zum
night.
Schutz
These are radar
sozusagen
days, which
der armen
means, so to
Menschen im
speak, to
Straßenverkehr.
protect
Den
the poor
helfen wir
people
jetzt
on
mal
the
alle.
road. And that's
Das
exactly
sind
what
Idioten.
then
Stimmt
everyone
doch,
drives
dass alle,
slowly on those
dass dann
days.
alle langsam an dem einen Tag.
Exactly. That's a
Genau.
ploy to
Das
catch
sind
the fools who
Dummenfang, die
didn't
nicht
listen
Radio
to the
gehört haben
radio.
vielleicht. Ne?
And
So.
it's
Und
exactly the
genau
same
das
with these
Gleiche ist
days
bei
of
diesen
action against the
Aktionstagen
right.
gegen rechts. Es finden Demos statt.
There are
Die
demonstrations in
stellen sich zum
cities.
Teil
Some
vor
of the
Häuser.
demonstrators
Also die sind
position
zum Beispiel in
themselves in front of
Niedersachsen aufs
houses.
Land
For
gefahren.
example, let's say
Und
in
da sind
Lower
vorher
Saxony,
die
the demonstrators drove to
Aktivisten
the
durch das
countryside.
Dorf
And before
gelaufen
they
und
arrived,
haben an
activists walked
Haustüren
through the
Zeichen
village and
gemacht
made
bei
signs on the doors of
ordentlichen
politically
Bürgern.
correct
Und bei den
citizens.
anderen haben sie
And
gezielt
they
keine Zeichen
deliberately
gemacht.
didn't make
Und dann
signs for
haben die
the
sich vor
others.
das Haus gestellt
And
und
then they
Leute
stood in front of
zusammengebrüllt.
the house and
Das waren
shouted at the people
SA-Orden, die
inside.
da gewesen
Just
sind, ohne dass
stormtroopers, but
SA
that
auf
they
der
were.
Nummer
But there
stand.
was no outward
Also die
sign
sind
that
Wer
that's
sind
what
denn,
they were.
was
Who
sind
are
das
these
für
people? Who
Leute?
are these
Wer sind
activists?
diese Aktivisten?
Well, you see,
Also
a
Sie
normal
müssen
person
sehen,
doesn't
ein
have any
normaler
time.
Mensch hat ja gar
They
keine
work,
Zeit. Der
they have time
arbeitet,
off
der hat
work, they have to
Freizeit, der
take
muss
care
sich um
of their
seine
family,
Familie kümmern.
which
Es
means that
sind im
these activists are
Regelfall
usually losers,
Loser,
university
Abbrecher,
dropouts, students, and
Studenten
people
und
without
Leute,
degrees who
die
live on
ohne
some kind of
Studienabschlüsse
subsidy
von
and on state
irgendwelchen
welfare.
Zuschüssen
They're
leben und von
state-funded attackers.
staatlicher Sozialhilfe. Es sind staatsbezahlte
And how are they being
Wie
organized?
organisiert?
Precisely
Genau
through the
durch die
NGOs.
NGOs.
For
Du bist dann zum
example,
Beispiel
let's
Mitglied
say
der
you are
Omas
a
gegen
member of the
Rechts.
Grandmas
Ne?
Against the
Die
Right.
Omas gegen Rechts
The
rufen
Grandmas
jetzt zur
Against the Right are
Demonstration am
calling for a
13.8.
demonstration on
raus.
August
Dann
13th.
holen die ihre
They
Aktivisten
then
raus und
bring out
fragen
their
noch 5 andere
activists, ask
Omas.
5 other
Und dann
grandmas,
fahren
and
die
then they
auf
drive their
Staatskosten
estate
ein und kriegen noch
expense
ihr
and receive
Tagesgeld
their daily
ausbezahlt, das
allowance
sie
for having
demonstriert haben.
participated in the
Und dann geht's wieder
demonstration,
nach
and then they
Hause.
drive back home.
Wobei die
The
Omas gegen
grandmas
Rechts jetzt
against
nicht
the right, they
körperlich
don't have a
aggressiv
physically
erscheinen
threatening
oder werden.
appearance,
Aber
nor
wenn
do
so
they
100
become
Leute
physically
sich vor
aggressive.
irgendeine
But when
Firma
people,
stellen
when
oder
a
vor
hundred
einen
people
Laden
stand in
und
front
die
of a
schreien,
company
der
or a
Eigentümer ist
storefront and
aber
shout,
rechts, ne,
the
das ist
owner is
AfD-Mitglied, der hat den
right-wing,
hier
that's a member
verkauft,
of the
ne, dann
AfD
ist
who
der
is
schon
selling
erschrocken
here,
als
then the store owners and
Einzelunternehmer.
entrepreneurs get frightened. Do
Wissen
you
Sie, wie
know how
viel
much
Geld
money
diese
these
Aktivisten
activists get?
bekommen?
I
Entschuldigung?
can't say for
Wissen Sie,
sure,
wie viel
but
Geld diese
they get a
Aktivisten
daily
bekommen?
allowance,
Das kann ich
which
nicht
can vary
belastbar
greatly
sagen,
from group to
aber die
group.
kriegen ein
So it's not
Tagegeld,
like
das auch sehr
1,000 euros
unterschiedlich
per
sein
day or
kann von
something,
Einrichtung
but
zu
they get their
Einrichtung.
travel expenses and between
Also das sind jetzt
50
nicht
and
1.000 €
300
pro
euros per
Tag oder
day.
aber die kriegen ihre Fahrtkosten
So
und zwischen
if you're at
50 und
home and
300
have
€.
nothing to do,
So, und wenn du
then you
zu
might
Hause bist,
decide to go
300,
somewhere to
300
get
ja,
your
wenn du zu
50 or
Hause
100
bist und
euros
hast nichts zu
and
tun,
have a
dann
fun
fährst du auch für
day.
50 und 100 € und einen lustigen Tag irgendwo hin.
There used to
Früher
be
gab es in Deutschland
Butterfahrten, butter
Butterfahrten.
trips in
Kennen Sie das
Germany. Do you
noch?
remember those? Yes.
Ja,
For your listeners,
Butterfahrten jetzt für Ihre
were
Hörer,
people who basically went on a
das
big
waren
day
Leute,
trip for
die
free.
haben im
And the
Prinzip
business model
kostenlos
was
einen
based on
großen
some of the
Aufschmuck
people
gemacht und
buying
das
something during
Geschäftsmodell
the
lief
trip.
darauf, dass
These
ein Teil der
political
Leute hat dann
action
was
trips are
gekauft. Ne?
organized in a
Und so
similar
ähnlich wie die
way as these butter
Butterfahrten in
trips were years
Deutschland
ago.
funktionieren im Moment diese politischen Aktionen.
So, und
Let's go
zurück zu
back
dem,
to, what's his
wie
name?
heißt der,
Stefan Niehoff.
Ja, Entschuldigung.
Was ist, ja, kein Problem.
You're talking about the
Sie sprechen
Moron
vom
case now,
Schwarzkopffall
right?
jetzt, ne?
Exactly, the
Genau,
Moron
der
case.
Schwarzkopffall.
Ja. Der
For a
Name
moment, I
war mir
couldn't
jetzt
remember his
gerade
name.
sogar
So
entfallen.
it was
Also, es
basically
ging im
about
Prinzip
this.
darauf,
There's
es
a
gibt in
well-known brand
Deutschland
in
eine
Germany,
bekannte
which is
Marke, die
also
wird auch in
sold
den
in the
USA
US,
verkauft,
called
die heißt
Schwarzkopf.
Schwarzkopf.
It's a well-known
Das ist ein
shampoo, but
bekanntes
they also make
Shampoo,
other
die machen
cosmetic
aber auch
products.
andere
Here in Germany,
Kosmetikprodukte. Also
Schwarzkopf
bei uns
is
so
as well
bekannt
known
wie
as
Procter
Procter &
Gamble.
Gamble.
Hm?
And
Und
there's
da
a
ist
logo
ein
on the
Signet,
shampoo
also ein
bottle, the
Scherenschnitt
silhouette.
darauf.
And
Ja?
on
Und
the
auf diesem
silhouette, you can
Scherenschnitt ist halt
see a
ein Mann
man. And now the silhouette was changed to look like the head of Habeck. And underneath it simply said Schwachkopf instead of Schwarzkopf. And Schwachkopf means moron in German. So ultimately, it's a play on words. It's ironic. And then this went viral on the internet because it was really funny. Now, the man who reposted it, he was more of the simple-minded type, I would say. He reposted it because thousands or hundreds of thousands had reposted it too. But in this particular case, for what reasons I cannot fathom, he wasn't some well-known politician or high official. His house was searched by the police. And the justification was that Mr. Habeck himself filed a criminal complaint against him, and that's why the man was prosecuted. Not because some crazy government official had decided to go after him, although that also happens everywhere. No, Habeck personally filed a criminal complaint against him. So this Mr. Niehoff took this meme and he didn't create it himself. Yes,
Und er hat es nicht selber entwickelt, er hat es
He
einfach
reposted it,
repostet.
that's
Ich
all.
weiß nicht, auf
Reposted,
welchem
genau.
reposted
On
und
which
auf welchem,
social media, do you
Social
know?
Media, wissen Sie das?
As far as
Soweit
I
ich weiß,
know,
war das
it
bei
was
ihm
on
auf, das war
Facebook.
so, das ist ein älterer
He's an
Herr,
older
also Facebook,
gentleman,
ne?
Auf
Also der
Facebook,
war,
so
okay.
he
der war
was
auf
on
Facebook.
Facebook.
Okay. Und
It
es
is
kann man
possible
mal,
that it was
lag er
later
auf Twitter
published on
irgendwo,
X.
das
I
weiß
don't
ich
know,
nicht.
but I
Aber
know
ich
it was
weiß,
on
dass es
Facebook.
Facebook war.
Okay, so this
okay,
means
also
sounds
dieses
like a
Meme
good
wirklich,
idea. Sounds
ist eine
funny.
gute Idee, hört sich lustig
There were
an.
like
Das hat wahrscheinlich
thousands,
von
maybe tens of
Tausenden,
thousands of
vielleicht
people.
Zehntausenden Leuten
Aber es
repostet
hat
But
nur
worden.
only
einen
one were
erwischt,
punished
weil nach
for
der
it,
alten
following the old
stalinistischen
Stalinist
Methode
method.
erschieße
One and
einen
hit a
für eine
million.
Million.
And you
Und
say
Sie
that
sagen, dass
Robert Habeck,
Robert
who is the
Habeck,
German
also
Minister
der
for
Minister
Economic
für
Affairs
Wirtschaft
and
und der ist Minister
also
für Wirtschaft
also
und
Vice-Chancellor.
Vizekanzler.
Und
Exactly,
Gedöns, genau.
Vice-Chancellor, Minister for
Vizekanzler,
Economic Affairs,
Wirtschaftsminister
and even
noch
still in
und Amt
office,
sogar.
still in office.
Noch im
You
Amt.
say
Der hat,
he
Sie sagen, er
personally
hat
filed a criminal
persönlich
complaint.
eine
Ja,
Yes, the
Anzeige
complaint.
mit einer
There's a
persönlichen
personal criminal
Strafanzeige, mit
complaint
seinem
with his signature,
Strafantrag, mit seiner
with his
persönlichen
personal
Unterschrift.
signature. So
Also
not
nicht
in some
irgendwie
way
nach dem
along
Motto,
the
ich weiß
lines
auch
of,
nicht genau,
I
wie
don't
das
know
passiert
exactly
ist,
how that
sorry.
happened,
Er hat
sorry.
mehr
No,
als 500
he personally
Strafanzeigen
filed more than
persönlich erstattet. Im
500
Übrigen
criminal
wird er
complaints.
von Frau
Okay,
Baerbock
Ms.
noch ein bisschen
Baerbock has even
überstritten, jetzt glaube
exceeded
ich
that number,
700.
but now I
Ich
think
weiß
she
gar nicht, was sie
reached
den ganzen Tag
700
machen.
criminal complaints. He probably
wahrscheinlich
has
ist er
someone who
jemand, der
does
nichts
nothing but
anderes
search
macht,
the
als das
internet to see
Internet
against
zu
whom he can
durchsuchen und
file a
zu schauen,
criminal
wem
complaint.
jener Strafanzeige
The
erstatten
state
kann.
Das
does
macht
that
der
for him
Staat.
already. Yes, that's
Ja, das
true.
macht
The
er
state
richtig.
already
Das
does
macht der
that for
Staat schon
him.
für ihn.
And what happened to
Und was
Mr.
ist mit
Niehoff?
Herrn Niehoff passiert?
Yeah, so
Ja,
I
also
have to
gab zwei
mention two
Sachen
things
nochmal.
again.
Also
First,
erstens,
that's
es
the
gab
second
also
principle
das ist
again, the
wieder das
so-called
zweite
principle of
Prinzip, das ist das sogenannte
proportionality.
Prinzip der
I talked about it
Verhältnismäßigkeit. Ich hatte
earlier.
das gerade mal erwähnt.
Actions must be
Maßnahmen müssen
proportionate. So,
verhältnismäßig
for
sein. Also
example,
wenn
if
ich
I know
weiß, da
there's a
ist
child
irgendwo ein
molester at work
Kinderschänder bei der
somewhere,
Arbeit, dann kann ich
then of
natürlich
course
mit
the
der
police will
Polizei
get a house
einbrechen
search
und
warrant
dem
and
einfach
search
da
his house.
reinfallen. Und wenn ich
And if
weiß,
I
der hat
know he's
illegale
storing
Waffen
illegal
gelagert
weapons or
oder
something
irgendwas
else, then they
anderes,
could
ne,
also
dann
get a
kann ich
house
eine
search
Hausdurchsuchung
warrant.
machen und kann
But
das
this was
machen.
clearly
Also
a
ein
reposting
offensichtliches
offense. So he simply reposted
Reposting-Delikt
something, and he
gewesen. Also
probably
der hat
did this
einfach
on
nur
his
was
cell phone.
gepostet
From
und
what
es war
else? Well,
wahrscheinlich von
maybe
seinem
from his
Handy aus
computer.
gemacht. Von
So,
was sonst?
as a
Vielleicht von
consequence, a
seinem
search is
Computer.
carried out to search
So,
his entire
daraus
house,
findet
but
eine
nothing is
Haussuchung
found.
statt, um
There
sein
is
ganzes
nothing to
Haus
be
zu
found.
durchsuchen. Es gibt
Everyone
nichts zu
already knew
finden.
that.
Es gibt
The
nichts zu finden,
idea
das wussten
was
schon
to
alle vorher.
instill fear
Ja.
and
Es
terror
ging darum,
among the
Angst
affected
und
people.
Schrecken bei den
Those
Betroffenen zu
people aren't
verbreiten.
lawyers who
Das sind ja
say,
nicht
come in, I
Anwälte, die
want to
sagen, kommen Sie
clarify
rein, ich möchte
ABC with
erstmal
you
A und
first.
C mit Ihnen
No,
abklären.
those
Die
people
Leute
stand in
stehen in
front of the
Zuchtschlangen
door in
vor der Tür,
total
die haben noch
shock.
nie einen
They've
näheren
never in
Zugriff
their
zur
lives had the
Polizeiakte in
police
ihrem
come
Leben.
after them.
Und
And
plötzlich
all
eine
of a sudden,
Haussuchung.
their house
Dann
is being
geben Sie bitte
searched.
Ihr
And
Handy
then they are
raus. Es
asked to
gibt
hand
keinen
over
Grund,
their
das
cell
Handy
phone. It makes no
rauszugeben. Ne?
sense to ask them to
Notfalls
hand
machst du
over
es
the
aus,
cell
gibst es
phone.
aus, dann kaufst
But
du
if
dir ein
you
neues
have to,
iPhone,
you
lädst das
turn it
zuletzt
off,
wieder
hand it
hoch, bist
over.
genau da,
Then
wo
you
du
buy a
gewesen
new
bist.
iPhone, load
Ja?
your content
Das
back
heißt,
up,
das
and you're
Handy
right
wird
back to where you
beschlagnahmt
were.
als
That means the
Terrormaßnahme
cell
des
phone is
Staates.
confiscated as a
Es hat
terror
keine
tactic by the
Funktionalität
state.
mehr,
The phone
weil
itself
auf dem Handy
no
sind
longer
die
has
Daten
any
ja heute im
functionality
Regelfall nicht
because
mehr.
the data
Die
is
sind ja
usually
im
no
Land
longer
gespeichert.
stored on the cell phone these days. It's stored
Richtig.
somewhere
Also Sie
else.
als Anwalt,
Tell me, since you are a
was
lawyer,
für
what
Rechte
rights would
was
Mr.
für
Niehoff
Rechte
have
hätte
had?
der Herr
Could he have
Niehoff
said,
gehabt? Hätte er
no, I'm
sagen
not
können,
giving you
nein,
my
ich
cell
gebe
phone.
Ihnen mein
You
Handy
have no
nicht, Sie
right
haben
to take
kein
my
Recht, mir
phone
das
away
Handy
from me.
wegzunehmen.
In dem
The
Moment, wo
moment
die vor
they
der Tür
stood at the
stehen,
door,
stand
they
eine,
stood
das ist
there
das
with the
nächste, es
search
gibt einen
warrant. First, I
vollidiotischen
have to
Richter, ich
say
muss
that
das
there
mal
is
so
this
sagen. Ne?
completely
Der hat
idiotic
diesen
judge. I
Durchsuchungsbefehl
can't say it
ausgestellt.
any
Ich
nicer,
glaube,
who issued the
zwischenzeitlich,
search
früher
warrant.
war die
There are two
Richterprüfung,
ways in
auch für
Germany to get a search
Durchsuchungsbefehle gibt es
warrant.
zwei
One is
Möglichkeiten in
imminent
Deutschland. Das ist
danger,
die
namely that a
Fahndungsvollzug.
crime
Ne?
is being
Also
committed
gut, also
behind
ich
the
weiß,
door
hinter der
right
Tür
now.
findet gerade eine
As a
Straftat
police
statt. Dann
officer,
können
you don't have to
Sicherheitspolizisten
wait
nicht
until the
warten,
crime has been
bis irgendwas
committed. So
passiert,
if
dann
there
gehe
is
ich rein.
imminent
Ne?
danger, you go
Oder aber
in.
ich will
The
etwas
second way is that the
untersuchen.
police want
Da
to
muss ich einen
investigate
Durchsuchungsbefehl
something.
des Gerichts
To do
haben.
that,
Das
one needs
heißt,
to
der
get a
muss jetzt
search warrant
vorlegen,
from a
was er gerade
court,
zu
and you
finden
have
hofft.
to tell the
Das
judge
heißt, er
what
hat
it
diesem
is that
Richter
you expect to
vorgelegt,
find.
dieses
With this
Schwachkopf,
picture of the
Schwarzkopf
Schwarzkopf or rather
Bild. Und
Schwachkopf,
der hat
Moron
gesagt, oh,
picture,
das
and
ist
the
eine
judge judge says, oh, that's such a terrible crime, you must search the house. A normal judge with an IQ of over 70 would have said, that's not a crime. What do you actually want to do there? I'm not going to issue a search warrant for nonsense. That is what a proper judge would have said in the past. Today, they'll do it automatically. Judges are supposed to check whether what they are asked to do is constitutional, but this is no longer done in any serious way, which means that our legal system erodes and starts to run wild in a moral sense too. Well, so what can you do when the police knock on your door and want to search your house? There's nothing you can do. The judge issued the search warrant. The police are in front of the door, and if you don't let them in, then they are free to use firearms in order to enter the house, which means you must let them in. Later on, you can petition the court for a ruling of disproportionate measures, but first you have to endure the police searching your house. And what happened to Mr. Niehoff next? I don't know, since I'm not his lawyer, so I don't know the exact nature of his case. Criminal proceedings are currently underway against him, and these can go through 2 or 3 appeals. That means he'd first receive a penal order, and then there would be a court hearing before a German district court. He can then appeal to the regional court against that verdict, and then he can appeal the regional court's decision. And only when the highest court has made its decision will we know what the outcome is, and that's open to debate.
Dann weiß man, was daraus geworden ist. Und das ist offen.
How much does something like that cost to go through various appeals in Germany? It's not as expensive as in the US, but on average, over 3 instances, you'll spend 3,000 to 5,000 euro on average if you have a lawyer, and only if you have a lawyer who bills you according to the official fee schedule. If you have someone who works on a discretionary basis, then you're looking at 10,000 euros. And what's the average income in Germany? The net income, I'm not sure about that, but let's say that the average income of a normal household is, well, you have to differentiate between pre-tax income and disposable income. That's well under 2,000 euros per month. That means you basically just spent your annual vacation and your new car on one post. You said something interesting a few minutes ago. You talked about a reposting offense. So what Mr. Niehoff did, reposting, is that really an offense in Germany? Reposting is, of course, only an offense if what you repost is illegal. That means, in other words, if I repost something even without giving it much thought, then I'm fully liable under criminal law. That means reposting is as if I had created the post myself. But what about, well, first of all, how are you supposed to know what constitutes criminal content? Sometimes, I don't know, often it's not clear. And secondly, many people don't repost things because they agree with them, but rather as an example of something they find terrible or interesting, but not because they necessarily think it's great. Law knows everything better than you. German law says that if you simply repost something, then in case of doubt, it is assumed that you endorse the content of the post. If you do not stand behind the content of something I post, you have to add in writing, "That's so terrible, please don't repeat it," or "I'm against it." Then you can, so to speak, exonerate yourself from it. But a mere reposting is a repetition of the statement of the person who originally posted it with the assumption of an endorsement of its meaning. Yes, that's how it is here in the USA as well.